3 days after burying her husband of 41 years. Carolyn Hayes opened his will. She expected medical bills, maybe a little insurance money, perhaps the family farmhouse. Instead, her husband left her 6 broken tractors. Not one of them could start. Not one of them had touched a field in decades. And according to nearly everyone in town, they were worth little more than scrap metal. Her son begged her to sell them. The auction company offered to haul them away. Even the attorney quietly admitted they would probably cost more to keep than they were worth. Only one old farmer refused to agree. He looked across the dusty barn where the 6 rusted tractors sat in a perfectly straight line and softly said, "Don't let anyone take even one of them until you know why your husband spent 20 years refusing every offer." Carolyn thought her husband had simply been sentimental, maybe stubborn, maybe unable to let go of old machinery. But a few days later, after opening the barn for the first time since the funeral, she noticed something she had somehow never seen before. Each tractor carried a small brass number plate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And beneath the 6th tractor, someone had hidden a wooden box that had clearly been placed there on purpose. Before we discover why 6 broken tractors became the most valuable thing Carolyn's husband ever owned, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. What time is it where you are right now? Leave a comment below. I always enjoy seeing how many different places around the world come together to share these stories. If you're listening in the morning, I hope you have a peaceful and wonderful day ahead. If it's evening where you are, I hope this story helps you relax after a long day. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about family legacies, forgotten farms, and ordinary people whose greatest wealth was the lives they touched, please subscribe to the channel and join our growing community. Now, let's go back to the day Carolyn Hayes believed her husband had left her nothing but 6 worthless tractors and unknowingly stepped into the greatest story of his life. Carolyn Hayes stood quietly beside the fresh mound of earth long after everyone else had left the cemetery. The folding chairs had already been loaded into trucks. The flowers surrounding the grave swayed gently beneath a warm afternoon breeze, and the distant voices of neighbors slowly disappeared as they drove back toward town. For 41 years, she had rarely gone a full day without hearing her husband's voice somewhere around the farm. Whether he was calling for a wrench from the barn, laughing with neighbors over coffee, or humming while repairing old machinery, the farm had always sounded alive because he was there. Now the silence felt almost impossible to understand. 3 days later, Carolyn sat beside her son Ryan inside attorney Linda Brooks's office. The room smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. A framed photograph of the county courthouse hung behind Linda's desk as she opened a neatly organized file marked with Harold Hayes' name. Harold had never been interested in expensive things. Their farmhouse had remained unchanged for decades. He drove the same pickup truck for nearly 20 years and repaired almost everything instead of replacing it. Carolyn expected the will to be simple. She assumed the farm would automatically remain in the family, with enough insurance money to settle a few remaining medical bills. Linda adjusted her glasses before speaking gently. "Your husband updated his will 2 years ago." Carolyn nodded quietly. "The farmland and the farmhouse transferred directly to you under joint ownership," Linda explained. "Most financial accounts were used during Harold's illness." Ryan reached over and gently squeezed his mother's hand. Neither of them had expected much after months of hospital expenses. Linda turned another page. "There is one specific personal bequest." Carolyn looked up. "The 6 tractors inside the north barn are left solely to Mrs. Carolyn Hayes." Ryan blinked. "The old tractors?" Linda smiled apologetically. "Yes." Carolyn exchanged a confused glance with her son. Harold had refused to part with those 6 rusted tractors for as long as either of them could remember. None had started in years. Some lacked engines. Others were missing wheels or steering parts. Every spring, Ryan had suggested selling them for scrap. Every spring, Harold answered exactly the same way. Not yet. Ryan leaned back in his chair. Mom, those things aren't worth anything. Linda nodded carefully. I did have an agricultural equipment appraiser stop by several months ago while updating the estate inventory. She looked down at her notes. Given their condition, the estimated scrap value is modest. Carolyn smiled faintly despite herself. Harold would probably have laughed hearing someone assign a value to those old machines. On the drive home, Ryan spoke gently. Mom, you don't have to keep everything just because Dad did. She watched fields passing quietly outside the truck window. Corn had begun pushing through the soil across neighboring farms, while their own lower field still waited for planting. Harold had planned to finish repairing the irrigation system before his illness became worse. Now many projects remained unfinished. The scrap company could haul them away in one afternoon, Ryan continued. It would clean out the barn and give you a little extra money. Carolyn understood his reasoning. The farm would be difficult enough to manage without 6 broken tractors collecting dust. Yet something about the will unsettled her. Harold had always been practical. If he specifically named those tractors instead of simply including them with the rest of the equipment, there had to be a reason. Late that afternoon, they returned to the farmhouse. The north barn stood beyond the pasture exactly as it always had, its weathered red paint fading beneath years of sun and rain. The large sliding doors remained closed. Harold had kept them locked except when he wanted to work alone. As Carolyn looked toward the barn, another pickup truck rolled slowly into the driveway. Owen Parker climbed out wearing his familiar straw hat. At 79, Harold's oldest friend still walked with the steady confidence of someone who had spent an entire lifetime working fields. He removed his hat respectfully before greeting Carolyn. I wish we'd met under better circumstances. She smiled sadly. Thank you for coming. Owen looked toward the north barn without saying anything for several moments. Finally, he asked, You read the will? Carolyn nodded. I don't understand why Harold left me 6 tractors that don't even run. Owen's weathered face softened with quiet understanding. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed Carolyn a sealed envelope bearing Harold's handwriting. He asked me to give you this after the funeral. Carolyn carefully opened it. Inside rested a single folded page. Only one sentence had been written. Don't sell a single tractor until you've learned why I kept every one. Carolyn folded Harold's letter carefully before slipping it back into its envelope. The single sentence stayed with her long after Owen drove away. Don't sell a single tractor until you've learned why I kept every one. She looked toward the north barn standing quietly beyond the pasture. During their 41 years together, Harold had spent countless evenings inside that building. Whenever she asked what he was working on, he usually smiled and answered, Just taking care of old friends. She had always assumed he meant old machinery. For the first time, she wondered if he had meant something else. The following morning dawned cool and clear. Ryan arrived shortly after breakfast carrying a toolbox, work gloves, and a thermos of coffee. If we're going to figure this out, he said, we might as well start with the barn. Carolyn nodded. Together they walked across the gravel yard toward the weathered red building. Harold's heavy brass key still hung from the ring inside the kitchen drawer where he had always left it. Carolyn unlocked the large sliding doors. They groaned softly before rolling open. Sunlight slowly spilled across the dusty floor. 6 tractors stood inside exactly as Harold had arranged them. They formed a perfectly straight line from one side of the barn to the other, each separated by the same careful distance. Dust covered every hood and tire, yet nothing appeared abandoned. The concrete floor beneath them had been swept. Cobwebs clung to the rafters, but not to the machines themselves. Someone had cared for them long after they stopped running. Ryan walked toward the nearest tractor. I forgot how many there really were. Carolyn smiled faintly. Your father never forgot. They moved slowly from one machine to the next. The first tractor was faded green with a cracked leather seat. The second wore peeling blue paint and carried one missing rear wheel. The third had no engine beneath its rusted hood. The fourth still displayed the name of its manufacturer, though nearly every letter had faded. The fifth leaned slightly because one tire had long ago gone flat. The sixth stood at the end of the row, larger than the others, its red paint hidden beneath decades of dust. Each tractor carried a small, polished brass plate attached to the steering column. Number 1, Number 2, Number 3, Number 4, Number 5, Number 6. Carolyn gently brushed dust from one of the plates. Unlike the tractors themselves, the brass shone brightly. Harold had polished every number by hand. Ryan noticed it too. He kept these clean. Carolyn nodded quietly. Every single one. Near the back wall of the barn stood Harold's old workbench. His wrenches still hung neatly from wooden pegs. Oil cans rested in careful rows beside sharpened drill bits and boxes of labeled bolts. Nothing suggested the hurried workshop of someone collecting junk. Everything reflected order. While Ryan swept years of dust from the floor, Carolyn opened the drawers beneath the workbench. Most contained ordinary tools, spare spark plugs, faded shop rags, and handwritten maintenance notes for equipment still used around the farm. Inside the bottom drawer, she discovered a worn leather notebook. Her heart lifted for a moment before she realized it wasn't a diary at all. It was Harold's tractor maintenance log. Every repair he had performed over the years appeared carefully recorded. Oil changes, tire replacements, engine rebuilds, new bearings, fresh paint. Each tractor occupied its own section. Carolyn turned eagerly toward the final pages. Several had been neatly torn away. Ryan looked over her shoulder. Looks like somebody removed them. Carolyn gently ran her fingers across the rough edge where the missing pages had once been. Harold never tore pages from his notebooks. Even grocery lists stayed where he wrote them. She closed the maintenance log carefully and placed it on the workbench. Owen arrived shortly before lunch carrying a basket of fresh tomatoes from his garden. He stepped quietly into the barn and smiled when he saw the doors standing open. First time this place has breathed in a while, he said softly. Carolyn held up the maintenance notebook. The last pages are gone. Owen studied it for only a moment before nodding. I wondered when you'd notice. Ryan looked up. Do you know what was on them? Owen smiled sadly. Not exactly. He glanced toward the row of tractors. Harold stopped using that notebook years ago. Carolyn looked from the notebook back to the 6 silent machines. Every tool remained where Harold left it. Every tractor still stood in perfect order. Only the final pages of the maintenance log had disappeared. Somehow, she knew they mattered as much as the letter folded safely inside her pocket. The torn pages from Harold's maintenance notebook remained on Carolyn's mind throughout the evening. She had known her husband long enough to recognize his habits. He saved receipts from hardware stores, kept faded seed catalogs long after they became outdated, and never removed a page from any notebook unless he had an important reason. Yet the final entries documenting the 6 tractors had disappeared without explanation. Early the next morning, Owen Parker stopped by carrying a small cardboard box. Inside rested several old black and white photographs protected by wax paper. "Thought these might help," he said as they gathered around the kitchen table. Carolyn carefully lifted the first photograph. It showed Harold as a young man standing proudly beside the first green tractor in the barn. The machine looked almost new then, its paint shining beneath the summer sun. Another photograph captured Harold and Owen working together in a freshly plowed field decades earlier. Ryan smiled faintly. "Dad actually drove number 1. Owen nodded. "For years." Carolyn looked more closely at the picture. Something caught her attention. Bolted to the steering column, exactly where it remained today, was the same small brass plate marked number 1. Harold had numbered the tractors long before they stopped running. "He labeled them back then," she said quietly. Owen smiled. "Every one of them." Curious to learn more, Carolyn suggested they visit Grace Miller at the County Agricultural Museum. Grace had spent years documenting the farming history of the region and often helped identify antique equipment for local families. Ryan loaded the photographs into the truck, and the three of them drove into town together. Grace welcomed them into a large workshop where restored tractors from different generations stood on display. She listened carefully as Carolyn explained Harold's unusual inheritance. 6 numbered tractors, Grace repeated thoughtfully. "Let's begin with number 1. She examined the old photograph before comparing it with several reference books and factory records stored in her office. After nearly half an hour, she smiled. This model was built in 1954. Ryan looked surprised. "Dad always said it wasn't especially rare." "It isn't," Grace agreed. "Mechanically, it's a fairly common tractor." She paused before tapping the photograph gently. "But history doesn't always come from rarity." Carolyn looked at the young Harold smiling beside the machine. "What do you mean?" Grace pointed toward several scratches visible beneath the tractor's hood in the enlarged photograph. "This tractor worked hard." Owen chuckled softly. "Harder than most." Grace smiled. "Machines don't earn character sitting inside barns." As they prepared to leave, Grace handed Carolyn a protective archival sleeve for the photograph. "If you find more pictures or documents, bring them to me." Sometimes ordinary objects become extraordinary because of the stories connected to them. Driving home, Ryan remained unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke. "Maybe Dad wasn't keeping junk after all." Carolyn glanced toward him with a gentle smile but said nothing. She knew he was beginning to see the tractors through different eyes. That afternoon, while returning the photographs to Harold's workbench, Carolyn noticed a faded envelope tucked beneath the maintenance notebook. It contained another photograph she had never seen before. Harold stood beside the first tractor again, but this time, he wasn't alone. A younger family stood with him in front of a weathered farmhouse. On the back of the picture, Harold had written only a single sentence. Number 1 was where it all began. Ryan read the words aloud before turning the photograph over once more. "Who's the family?" Carolyn slowly shook her head. "I don't know." Before either of them could speculate further, they noticed another folded sheet resting inside the envelope. It wasn't a letter. It was a simple handwritten note in Harold's familiar script. Only one line appeared across the page. "Before you understand number 2, remember what number 1 was built to do." Carolyn read Harold's note several times before setting it beside the photograph of the unknown family. "Before you understand number 2, remember what number 1 was built to do." The sentence troubled her because it sounded less like a clue and more like a correction. She had spent years seeing the tractors as broken machines Harold refused to release. Harold, apparently, had seen each one as something that had once served a purpose beyond the farm. The next morning, Owen arrived early, carrying a thermos and wearing the same quiet expression he had worn since the funeral. Carolyn met him in the barn with the photograph in hand. "Do you know this family?" Owen studied it for a long moment, then nodded. "The Whitakers." Ryan stepped closer. "Who were they?" Owen pointed to the young father standing beside Harold. "Tom Whitaker came down with pneumonia one spring. Bad timing. His lower field still needed plowing, and if he missed planting, they'd have lost the farm." Carolyn looked toward the faded green tractor marked number 1. "Harold helped him." Owen smiled softly. "Harold didn't just help. He drove that tractor over before sunrise every day for a week, plowed the field, seeded it, then came home and worked his own land until dark." Carolyn touched the edge of the photograph. She had never heard that story. Owen continued. "Tom tried to pay him. Harold refused. Said a tractor was made to pull more than its own weight." Ryan looked down at the concrete floor, suddenly less certain of his earlier scrap metal judgments. After lunch, they turned their attention to tractor number 2, the blue machine with one missing rear wheel. Its brass plate had been polished just like the first. Inside the cracked toolbox mounted behind the seat, Carolyn found a brittle envelope containing a small photograph and a folded receipt from a parts supplier. The photograph showed the blue tractor hitched to a wagon piled with sandbags near a flooded road. "That was the Miller flood," Owen said immediately. "The creek took out half the bridge." "Why was Harold there?" Carolyn asked. "Because the volunteer fire truck couldn't get through. Number 2 pulled wagons of sandbags all afternoon." Owen's voice softened. "Grace Miller's father was trapped on the other side with 2 injured men. That tractor helped clear the road enough to bring them home." Ryan exhaled slowly. "So number 2 wasn't kept because it was useful later. It was kept because it had already mattered." Carolyn glanced at him, grateful he had said it first. Later that afternoon, Grace Miller came to the farm after Owen called her. She stood before the blue tractor for a long time without speaking. "My father told that story every Thanksgiving," she said. "He always said Harold Hayes arrived with a tractor that looked too tired to save anyone, and then saved 3 people anyway." Her eyes filled as she touched the rusted fender. "I never knew this was the one." Together they moved to tractor number 3, the machine with its engine missing beneath the hood. Ryan opened the empty compartment and shook his head. "This one really is just a shell." Grace examined the frame, then noticed faint chalk marks inside the engine bay. Owen smiled sadly. That engine went into the Carver family's tractor during the winter of '89. Carolyn remembered the Carvers only vaguely. "Weren't their parents killed in an accident?" Owen nodded. "Left 3 teenagers trying to keep the farm running. Harold pulled the engine from number 3 and spent 2 nights installing it in theirs so they could finish feeding cattle through winter." Carolyn looked at the hollow tractor differently now. What had seemed like missing parts suddenly felt like evidence of sacrifice. That evening, Pastor Samuel Reed visited the farmhouse, bringing a small packet Harold had left with him months before his death. "He asked me to give this when Carolyn had learned the first stories," the pastor said gently. Inside was a short letter in Harold's handwriting. Carolyn read it aloud with Ryan beside her. "If you're beginning to see them as more than broken tractors, then you're beginning in the right place. Number 1 carried a neighbor's spring. Number 2 carried men through floodwater. Number 3 gave its heart so another farm could survive winter. Don't hurry through the rest. Every tractor earned its place. The words from Harold's letter changed the way Carolyn entered the barn the next morning. The 6 tractors no longer seemed like obstacles waiting to be removed. They stood like witnesses, each holding a part of her husband's life she had never been given the chance to hear. Ryan arrived after breakfast with coffee and a quieter manner than usual. He did not mention scrap metal or auction companies. Instead, he walked straight to tractor number 4 and brushed dust from its hood with his sleeve. "Where do we start?" he asked. Carolyn smiled gently. "With what your father left behind." Number 4 was the smallest tractor in the row. Its yellow paint almost completely faded beneath rust and grime. One headlight was missing, and the steering wheel had cracked in 2 places. Grace Miller joined them mid-morning carrying a folder of notes from the Agricultural Museum. She examined the tractor's frame, serial plate, and worn tires before nodding. "This one worked in orchards," she said. "Narrow rows, tight turns, not built for big fields." Owen rested one hand on the fender. "Harold bought it after the Ramsey place burned." Carolyn remembered the Ramsey family vaguely. "The apple farm." Owen nodded. "Fire took their packing shed and most of their equipment. They had fruit still hanging and no way to move through the orchard without damaging the trees." Ryan looked at the little tractor. "Dad used this." "Every day for nearly 3 weeks." Owen said. "Hauled crates from the trees to the road. Refused payment again." Grace opened her folder and removed a copied newspaper clipping showing Harold beside the yellow tractor, parked beneath rows of apple trees. Carolyn touched the edge of the paper. Her husband looked younger, thinner, and completely unaware anyone had photographed him. That afternoon, Ryan stayed to help repair a sagging section of the barn wall. It was the first time since the funeral that mother and son worked side by side without grief pressing between every word. As he held a board steady, Ryan said, "I used to think Dad wasted too much time helping other people." Carolyn hammered a nail carefully. "Sometimes I did too." Ryan looked toward the tractors. Maybe he knew exactly what he was doing. Near sunset, Grace discovered another maintenance sheet tucked beneath number 4's cracked seat. It listed several repairs in Harold's handwriting, but at the bottom was a small drawing of a key and the words, "When the 4th story is remembered, look where the driver sat." Ryan reached beneath the seat again and felt along the metal frame. A moment later, something small dropped onto the floor with a sharp ring. Carolyn bent down and picked it up. It was an old brass key, darkened with age but still solid. No tag hung from it, only a tiny number 4 had been scratched near the bow. Owen looked at the key, then toward Harold's workbench. "Your husband always did like making people earn the next answer." Carolyn held the key in her palm, feeling its weight. It did not look like much, but after everything they had learned, she knew it opened more than a lock. It opened whatever Harold had chosen to reveal next. Carolyn turned the small brass key over several times before slipping it carefully into her pocket. It was heavier than it looked, its worn edges polished smooth from years of handling. Harold had hidden it beneath the driver's seat of tractor number 4, knowing someone would only find it after understanding why the tractor mattered. Whatever came next, he wanted patience to come before discovery. The following morning, Ryan met Carolyn in the north barn before sunrise. Owen joined them a few minutes later, carrying fresh biscuits wrapped in a kitchen towel. The 3 of them stood before Harold's old workbench, where dozens of drawers and cabinets lined the wall exactly as he had left them. Ryan held up the brass key. "Where do you think it fits?" Owen studied it thoughtfully before pointing toward a small steel toolbox resting beneath the workbench. Unlike the larger red tool chest beside it, this gray box had always remained locked. Carolyn recognized it immediately. Harold never allowed anyone to borrow it, though she had never questioned why. She knelt beside the box and inserted the key. It turned smoothly. The latch released with a soft click. Ryan lifted the lid. All three leaned forward, expecting another letter, another notebook, or perhaps the missing pages from the maintenance log. Instead, they found neatly arranged keepsakes. A worn volunteer fire department badge, a faded ribbon from a county harvest festival, several handwritten thank you notes tied together with twine, a child's drawing of a green tractor beneath a bright blue sky. Carolyn picked up the drawing first. Across the bottom, written in uneven pencil, were the words, "Thank you, Mr. Hayes, for helping my daddy." Her eyes filled as she quietly returned it to the box. Ryan unfolded one of the letters. "Dear Harold," he read softly, "you told us neighbors shouldn't keep score. We never forgot what you did." Another note thanked Harold for repairing equipment during a difficult season. Another simply read, "Our family is still farming because you showed up when no one else could." Owen smiled quietly. He kept every one. Carolyn looked through the box carefully. There was no money, no deed, no hidden fortune, only reminders of lives Harold had quietly touched without ever speaking about them. Ryan closed the lid gently. "This isn't what I expected." "Neither did Harold," Owen replied. "He never helped people expecting anything back." Carolyn noticed a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the bottom tray of the toolbox. She unfolded it carefully. It wasn't a letter. It was a rough, hand-drawn sketch of the north barn. Measurements covered the page, showing beams, windows, workbenches, and storage shelves. Ryan frowned. "Dad drew the barn?" Owen leaned closer. "No." He pointed toward one corner near the workbench. "He added that later." A small section beneath the office floor had been shaded in pencil. Beside it, Harold had written only 3 words, "Below the office." Carolyn looked toward the tiny office built inside one corner of the barn. Harold had handled farm paperwork there every evening after chores. The room held a battered desk, filing cabinet, and an old wooden chair that still faced the window overlooking the fields. Ryan carried the sketch inside while Carolyn slowly examined the floorboards. Nothing appeared unusual. The worn pine planks matched the rest of the room. Owen studied Harold's drawing again. "He wasn't marking the office," he said quietly. "He was marking something underneath it." Carolyn looked down at the floor once more. Whatever Harold wanted them to find hadn't been hidden inside the toolbox after all. The keepsakes had simply reminded them why the search mattered. Now the hand-drawn map pointed silently toward the next place Harold had prepared long before anyone opened his will. Carolyn stood in Harold's small barn office with the hand-drawn sketch spread across his desk. Ryan knelt on the floor, tapping each pine board with the handle of a screwdriver, while Owen watched from the doorway. The shaded section on Harold's map seemed to point beneath the office, but the boards gave back the same dull sound everywhere. Nothing shifted. Nothing lifted. After nearly an hour, Ryan sat back on his heels and shook his head. If Dad hid something here, he hid it better than a bank vault. Carolyn looked again at the sketch. The words "below the office" had seemed obvious the night before, but now she noticed the line Harold had drawn did not stop under the desk. It continued upward along the inside wall, toward the rafters above the barn. Owen followed her gaze. "There's a loft over this corner," he said quietly. Carolyn stepped outside the office and looked up. High above the workbench, partly hidden behind hanging tarps and spare lumber, a narrow loft ran along the back wall. Harold had used it for storage when Ryan was young, but Carolyn had not climbed up there in years. Ryan frowned. "Mom, those boards may not be safe." "Then we go carefully," Carolyn replied. He helped position the ladder while Owen held it steady. Carolyn climbed only halfway before Ryan insisted on going first. A minute later, he called down, "It's dusty, but solid." Carolyn followed slowly, her hands gripping the ladder rails. The loft smelled of hay, old canvas, and dry wood. Morning light entered through a small round window, revealing boxes stacked along the wall. Some held farm receipts. Others contained Christmas decorations, jars of bolts and feed sacks folded with Harold's usual neatness. They searched patiently, opening one box at a time. Carolyn found photographs of harvests, fair ribbons, and a pair of Ryan's old work boots from when he was 12. Ryan laughed softly when he saw them, then grew quiet as he turned them over in his hands. Dad kept everything. Carolyn smiled. Only what mattered to him. In a cedar chest near the far end, they found more keepsakes tied to the tractors: a sandbag tag from the Miller flood, a cracked apple crate label from the Ramsey orchard, and a small horseshoe wrapped in newspaper with Harold's note identifying it as belonging to the Carver farm. Each object connected to a story they had already heard. Each one proved Harold had been building something larger than a collection of machines. But there was no ledger, no missing maintenance pages, no full explanation. After 2 hours, Ryan leaned against a beam, frustration showing on his face. Maybe we're missing it. Carolyn looked across the loft at the opened boxes and carefully arranged memories. Or maybe your father wanted us to understand these first. Owen, still standing below, called up from the barn floor. Look near the window. Harold used to keep an old seed cabinet up there. Ryan moved aside a rolled canvas tarp and found a narrow wooden cabinet tucked against the wall. Its drawers were shallow and labeled by crop: corn, clover, beans, rye. Most were empty. The bottom drawer stuck until Carolyn pulled carefully with both hands. Inside lay a single envelope, clean despite the dust around it. Harold's handwriting crossed the front. For Carolyn and Ryan. Her breath caught. She opened it slowly. Inside was one sheet of paper. If you've reached the loft, then you've seen what I saved after the work was done. A photograph fades, a badge tarnishes, a note grows brittle. But each one reminds us that help given quietly still leaves a mark. Carolyn paused, her voice trembling. Ryan stood beside her, listening with lowered eyes. She continued reading. You may be searching for the final record. Don't hurry. The tractors tell only half the story. That was all. No directions, no explanation. Only that sentence. Ryan took the paper gently and read it again. The tractors tell only half the story, he whispered. Below them, the 6 machines stood in their straight, silent line, waiting in the dusty barn light, as though Harold had left more than memories behind. Carolyn climbed down from the loft with Harold's latest note folded carefully in her hand. The tractors tell only half the story. She read the sentence again while standing on the barn floor, looking at the 6 silent machines lined in the dust. For days, she had been learning what each tractor had done. Yet Harold's message suggested the machines were not the true center of the inheritance. They were reminders. The real story belonged to the people connected to them. Ryan seemed to understand that too. He no longer moved through the barn like a man sorting junk. He walked slowly, stopping beside each tractor as though seeing another chapter of his father's life. By late morning, Grace Miller returned with a folder of copied records from the Agricultural Museum and several old newspaper clippings. She spread them across Harold's workbench while Carolyn, Ryan, and Owen gathered around. "I matched the first 4 tractors with the stories you found," Grace said. "The dates line up exactly." She tapped the photograph of number 1. Whitaker Field, then the blue tractor, Miller Flood, then the hollow frame of number 3, Carver Winter. Finally, the little yellow machine, Ramsey Orchard. Carolyn looked toward the remaining 2 tractors. "What about number 5 and number 6? Grace opened another clipping. Number 5 appears in a county fair photograph from 1996. The image showed Harold standing beside the faded tractor, which at the time looked freshly repaired. A handwritten note on the back identified a benefit harvest for the Dawson family after an accident left their father unable to work. Owen recognized it immediately. Harold used number 5 to pull the grain wagons that week. Ryan's voice was quiet. "I remember Dad being gone late that summer." Carolyn did too. She had thought he was helping Owen with field work. She had never known he was helping another family keep its crop from rotting before harvest. They walked to number 5 together. Beneath the dust, its worn tires still carried traces of dry clay hardened deep in the grooves. Grace ran one hand across the fender. "This tractor may not be rare, but its history is remarkable." Carolyn looked at the last machine in the row. Number 6 stood larger than the others, its red paint dark beneath age and dust. It had always seemed the least personal to her, more like a forgotten piece of equipment than something Harold would treasure. Ryan opened the side panel and examined the engine. "This one might still have most of its parts." Owen smiled faintly. "It had to." Harold always said number 6 was the one that brought everyone home. Carolyn turned toward him. "What does that mean?" Owen grew still for a moment. "Winter of 2004. Ice storm hit hard. Roads closed, power out, phones down. The nursing home outside town lost heat. Harold and a few others used this tractor to pull a generator through the back roads because trucks couldn't get through." Carolyn pressed one hand to her mouth. She remembered that storm. Harold had come home after midnight, soaked, freezing, and unwilling to say more than, "Folks needed help." Grace checked one more photograph in her folder. It showed the red tractor chained to a flatbed loaded with equipment, headlights cutting through snow. "That generator kept 32 residents warm until morning," she said. Ryan leaned against the tractor's hood, his eyes lowered. "Dad never told me any of this." Carolyn touched his arm. "He didn't tell me either." Ryan swallowed hard. "I thought he just collected broken things." Owen looked across the row. "No, he kept the ones that had already given everything they could." The barn fell quiet. Outside, wind moved through the fields Harold had loved, and for the first time Carolyn felt grief soften into something steadier. Pride, maybe. Gratitude. Ryan straightened and began sweeping around number 6 without being asked. Carolyn joined him. Together they cleared old straw, dust, and small pieces of rust from beneath the tractor. Grace knelt near the rear wheel, studying marks on the floor. "This section doesn't match the rest." Ryan crouched beside her and brushed more dirt away. Several floorboards beneath number 6 were newer than the surrounding planks, but Harold had stained them to blend in. Carolyn felt her heart quicken. Owen handed Ryan a pry bar, but Ryan looked first to his mother. She nodded. Carefully, he lifted one loose board, then another. Beneath the floor rested a small wooden box, tucked into the space below as though Harold had placed it there with both care and certainty. Carolyn knelt slowly beside it. On the lid, written in Harold's familiar hand, were the words, for the stories that were too heavy for steel. Carolyn rested both hands on the small wooden box before lifting it carefully from beneath the barn floor. Years of dust covered its sides, but the lid had been sealed tightly enough to protect whatever Harold had placed inside. Ryan carried it to the old workbench while Grace, Owen, and Pastor Samuel gathered quietly around. No one hurried Carolyn. By now they all understood Harold's habit of letting understanding arrive before answers. She slowly lifted the lid. Inside rested a thick, leather-bound ledger wrapped in brown cloth. Beneath it lay 6 folded letters, each marked with the brass number of one of the tractors. Carolyn gently removed the ledger first. Its cover carried only one line embossed in faded gold. What they gave. She opened the first page. Harold's familiar handwriting filled every line. There were no repair records, no financial accounts. Instead, each chapter carried the number of one tractor, followed by the names of people connected to it. Carolyn began reading aloud. Number 1. Tom Whitaker never repaid me for the spring planting. He wasn't supposed to. His harvest fed his family, and that was enough. She turned another page. Number 2. The flood washed away fences and roads, but it never washed away neighbors. Ryan lowered his eyes. Grace quietly wiped a tear before Carolyn continued. Every section told the full story behind the tractor they had already begun to understand. Harold described the Carver children surviving their first winter after losing their parents. He wrote about the Ramsey orchard producing one final apple harvest because the little yellow tractor fit between the damaged rows. He never praised himself. Instead, every entry focused on the courage of the families he had helped and the people who stood beside them. Pastor Samuel quietly nodded. That sounds exactly like Harold. Carolyn reached the final pages. There she found the missing entries torn from the maintenance notebook years earlier and carefully preserved inside the ledger. Harold had never thrown them away. He had simply moved them where they belonged. The last handwritten page read like a letter. If you're reading this, then you've already learned that the tractors were never the inheritance. They were reminders. Steel rusts, engines fail, paint fades. But kindness keeps working long after the machine has stopped. Silence settled over the barn. Owen quietly removed his hat. Grace closed her eyes for a moment. Ryan stared at the 6 tractors lined against the far wall, no longer seeing broken equipment. Carolyn folded the page gently. Pastor Samuel stepped forward carrying another envelope. Harold asked me to wait until this moment. Carolyn opened it carefully. Inside was only one sentence. When the stories have been remembered, invite them home. Grace looked toward Owen. Do you think the families would come? Owen smiled through damp eyes. Every one of them. Over the next several days, Grace contacted descendants of the Whitakers, Carvers, Ramseys, Dawsons, and the others whose names appeared throughout Harold's ledger. Pastor Samuel reached families the church still knew. Owen made phone calls of his own. One by one, people arrived at the Hayes farm carrying photographs, faded letters, and memories they had never expected to share again. Some recognized the tractors immediately. Others placed weathered hands upon rusted fenders without saying a word. One elderly woman quietly whispered, "My father always said this tractor saved our farm." Another man unfolded a yellowed thank you card written by his mother decades earlier. Ryan watched as strangers became familiar faces through Harold's words. Carolyn realized her husband had spent a lifetime building relationships she had never fully seen because he had never wanted recognition. As the afternoon sun settled across the barn, Owen stood beside Carolyn and looked toward the 6 tractors. Harold always believed a harvest wasn't measured only by what came out of the field. Carolyn smiled softly. Now I know what he meant. Owen nodded toward the ledger resting safely on the workbench. The account isn't finished yet. Carolyn looked down at the final line Harold had written beneath the last story. Finish one more harvest together. The words Harold had written at the bottom of the ledger seemed to settle over everyone in the barn. Finish one more harvest together. Carolyn read them again the next morning while standing beside the row of 6 tractors. For weeks, she had believed the machines were relics of a life she had only partly understood. Now she knew Harold had left them not to burden her, but to bring the people in his stories back to one another. Ryan arrived early with grease on his hands and a determination Carolyn had not seen in him since he was a boy following Harold through the fields. Behind him came Owen, Grace, Pastor Samuel, and several families whose names appeared throughout the ledger. No one expected the tractors to become beautiful again. That was not the point. They only needed to move one last time. The work began with careful hands and quiet purpose. Number 1 received new fuel lines and a repaired battery connection. Number 2 needed 1 borrowed wheel and a patched hose. Number 3, still missing its engine, could not run. So Ryan and Owen arranged to tow it behind one of the working tractors as a symbol of the parts it had once given away. Number 4 received fresh oil and a cleaned carburetor. Number 5's tires were patched just enough to hold air through the field. Number 6, the tractor that had hauled a generator through an ice storm, took the longest. Its engine coughed, shuddered, then finally turned over while everyone in the barn stood completely still. When it rumbled to life, Carolyn covered her mouth with both hands. Ryan looked toward the rafters, smiling through tears. "Dad would have loved that sound," he whispered. Over the next several days, the farm filled with people. The Whitaker family brought seed. The Ramseys sent apple crates for the harvest. The Carver grandchildren repaired fencing. The Dawsons helped service equipment. Others brought food, tools, fuel, and time. Carolyn watched people work across the land Harold had loved and understood. At last, what he meant when he said neighbors shouldn't keep score. The 6 tractors slowly moved from forgotten machines into living memory. Grace documented every repair and every story, photographing each brass number plate and recording the testimony of the families tied to them. She promised that once the final harvest was complete, the tractors would be preserved with their history, not displayed as valuable machines, but as proof that ordinary tools could carry extraordinary kindness. On the morning of the memorial harvest, the sky opened clear and gold. Pastor Samuel stood near the edge of the lower field with Harold's final letter in his hands. Families gathered beside the barn while the 6 tractors waited in a line. Still rusty, still dented, still bearing every scar they had earned. Samuel read aloud, his voice steady. "A farmer's worth is not measured by the acres he owns, but by the fields he helps others keep." Carolyn closed her eyes as the words moved through the crowd. When she opened them, Ryan was standing beside her with Harold's old barn key in his palm. "Mom," he said softly, "I don't want to sell them." She smiled. "Neither do I." He looked toward the tractors. "Maybe the barn shouldn't just be yours anymore. Maybe it should be where people come when they need remembering." Carolyn took the key from him, then placed it back in his hand and closed his fingers around it. "Then you help me keep it open." One by one, the tractors moved into the field. Number 1 led, pulling a small wagon of seed. Number 2 followed beside it. Number 3 rolled slowly behind, towed with care, honored for what it had given. Number 4 turned neatly at the edge of the field. Number 5 hauled the first crates. Number 6 brought up the rear, its engine steady under the autumn sun. Carolyn rode beside Ryan for the final pass, her hand resting on the metal fender warm from the engine. She no longer saw junk. She saw Tom Whitaker's Springfield, the flooded road, the Carver winter, the Ramsey orchard, the Dawson harvest, and the cold night when a nursing home stayed warm because Harold had gone out into a storm. By sunset, the work was finished. The 6 tractors were parked in a straight line outside the north barn, facing the fields they had helped serve one last time. Their paint remained faded. Their bodies still carried rust. But no one standing there would ever again call them worthless. Carolyn placed Harold's ledger on a small table near the barn doors, open to the final page. Grace had already prepared copies for the museum, while the original would remain with the farm. Pastor Samuel offered a quiet prayer. Owen stood with his hat over his heart. Ryan slipped the barn key into his pocket, not as a burden, but as a promise. As the last light settled over the farm, Carolyn stood before the 6 tractors and felt her grief change shape. Harold had not left her broken machines. He had left her 6 chapters of a life measured in service, humility, and love. The inheritance was never steel. It was the community that returned when the stories were finally remembered. And beneath the wide evening sky, with the old tractors resting shoulder to shoulder like faithful friends, Carolyn understood that her husband's greatest work had not ended with his funeral. It had only waited for one more harvest to begin again.